Muy buenos días aquí en Los Ángeles. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes en España. Casi noche, ¿verdad? All right. Can you all hear? ¿Se oye? Keep wanting to look there, but okay. Okay. Así se va a hacer la traducción durante toda la placa. Okay. Bueno, este es un experimento. This is an experiment we're trying the first time. But we're really very excited about. Okay. Is that how it's going to be? We're going to keep hearing the echo? Yeah. No, we need to turn that off. So they hear that, but we don't. All right. So this experiment is really very exciting because we bring together institutions in 3 countries. Here we are in Los Angeles. We have people from Spain and Mexico. We are joining with the permanent seminar on international migration, el Seminario Permanente sobre la Migración Internacional, que se ha organizado oh, I don't need to translate. They will do that. Okay. That has been organized since 1998 by el Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana, Mexico. In 2011, several other institutions from Mexico, Spain, and UCLA have joined the project, and so we are connecting with them through internet and video conference. This includes el Colegio de la Frontera Norte, el Colegio de México, el Colegio de la Frontera Sur, and the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social. All right. The talk today is co-sponsored by the Migration Studies Group, which is an interdisciplinary group here on campus. We give talks every other week throughout the year, and our next talk is in 2 weeks. We hope you will come to that as well. Normally our talks are at noon. So it's co-sponsored by the Migration Studies Group, but in order to accommodate the video conference, we've moved our time to 10. The other groups that are co-sponsoring are the California Center for Population Research and Sociology's Department's Family Working Group. And we're really very excited to have with us today Jennifer Glick, who is from the CPOD, not iPod, Center for, it was to be the Institution for Population Dynamics, but that was the iPod, so they are the Center for Population Dynamics at Arizona State University. She is the author of many articles, research articles on migration, family issues in migration, and she's the co-author of Achieving Anew, How New Immigrants Do in American Schools, Jobs, and Neighborhoods. So we welcome Jennifer, and we hope at the end we'll be able to have some kind of a conversation among the various institutions.
Well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yes, I can't tell from the mic where I am. So thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. And this is, I took this challenge seriously to talk across multiple units, multiple groups, and multiple disciplines. Of course, the risk is that I will leave everyone just somewhat dissatisfied because I'm trying to speak to multiple people. But I think there is something in here for the demographers, the sociologists, the immigration scholars, and perhaps some developmentalists and education scholars as well. So thank you very much again for the invitation. This is really going to be a talk about the continuation of work I've been doing for the last several years, but really giving more concrete thought to migration as a family process, or impacting families in terms of the whole family migration context, rather than just thinking about the individual migrant. And of course, this is very challenging to do for many methodological reasons. But when we think about, well, why this shift? Why shifting from studying individual migrants and sort of thinking about immigration as an interruption in the individual life course to thinking about how it impacts family life course and intergenerational relationships and dynamics. Part of the thing we can think about are just the demographic changes in immigrant streams. So migrant streams shift over time across generations and across, generations of migrants, waves of migrants, and then also across origins. And so we see shifts from, say, a migrant stream that might have been primarily made up of single working-age men, maybe labor migration, and then a shift through increases in chain migration, changes both in the sending communities in terms of women's education, for example, or increased labor force participation of women, but also changes in the receiving communities as well that encourage people from across the life course to migrate. And so you see big shifts in the demographic composition of entire migration streams. And of course, there's also population momentum in immigration or immigrant communities. And so here you can think of examples of, say, aging migrants. So if we have 2 immigrants in a community, in the receiving community somewhere in the United States, we can compare them, we can talk about their age and their needs, but we might be looking at 2 very different migration histories and migration patterns. So we might have someone who's aging in place, who has considerable work experience in the United States, versus somebody who's a fairly recent arrival, maybe someone who's joined their own children, maybe even migrated in order to be a part of that family unit. And so we might see some very different patterns then, and we'd have different expectations for what might be occurring inside those families based on that migration history. And then we have children of immigrants. And most of the examples I'm going to be showing you today will be thinking about children of immigrants in more detail, I think, than we have in the past. Now, again, I want to give a little something for the demographers here, so I borrowed this slide. I love this picture. It's very... I think it shows you very graphically, quite quickly, why children of immigrants are particularly important in the United States and becoming increasingly important in our research. Currently, approximately 1 in 5 children under the age of 18 has at least one foreign-born parent, but that rises to 25% when we're looking at very young children. So here you're looking at children between 0 and 8, and you're looking just at the growth of the child population. And so the entire growth, the increase in our child population in the United States from 2000 to 2008 is entirely driven by immigration. And I think, if we need a demographic reason for focusing on this group, or we want to try to convince our policymakers that this is an important population to study, this is a great way to do it, right? It's very grabs you right away. Now, there's some implications about this increase, and this is a diverse population. When we talk about children of immigrants, and we're talking, I said, have at least one foreign-born parent, and we kind of define that as our children of immigrants. But these may be children who are born in the receiving context, or they could be immigrants themselves, so they were part of their family's migration. They come from diverse national origins and multiple modes of entries. So their families entered multiple different ways to the United States, or to whatever receiving country, but right now I'm talking about the United States. And then also this has implications for the diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, and I'll show you that in just one second. These families also have different linguistic environments within the family household, and we know that from other research as well. So just again to kind of give the big picture here, thinking about the racial and ethnic composition of the child population in the United States, here you're looking at changes in the racial and ethnic composition of children of U.S.-born residents, and you're looking at census data, so 1970, 80, 90, and 2000. And we see that small decrease among non-Hispanic whites, and you see some small increase down here among other groups, but it doesn't look particularly dramatic. But remember, we have that 20 to 25% of children who are children of immigrants, and here's really where you see the driver then of the increasing racial and ethnic diversity in the United States. It's coming from immigration, and you see that large decrease in the percent of children of immigrants who are non-Hispanic white, and the large increase among other racial and ethnic groups. And that's really where we see this big shift in the racial and ethnic composition in the United States. So the numbers coming out from the 2010 census that are talking about shifts in minority populations are really talking about the legacy of these changes in immigration in the last couple of decades. Okay, so theoretically, what does this mean? And what are the implications of thinking about family migration and implications of these intergenerational transmission to children and children's outcomes? Traditionally, coming out of immigration research, I've grown up with the assimilation perspective, which really tends to focus on duration of residence in the receiving context. And it says, the longer you're there, the more education you get, the more you speak the language, the dominant language of the receiving community, the better off you'll be, right? Socioeconomic status improves and things shift over time. Or they shift across generations. And so we're used to looking at contemporary individuals of multiple generational backgrounds, right? So we're used to comparing people of the first generation, the immigrants themselves, to people in the second generation, those who are the children of immigrants, but at the same age, right? So we compare, high school dropout rates among first generation and second generation at the same point in time. And that's sort of traditionally what we've done with an assimilation perspective, even now when we have longitudinal data, right? We still follow people at the same ages over time. But when we think about what the outcomes might be for children, I think it's very important to think about what the developmental context, the family context is in which the second generation is being raised, for example. So we usually just combine the second generation, or we think maybe, do you have one foreign-born parent or two? We might think about the acculturation levels of the parents, how much English do they speak, how much education do they have, but we've rarely really thought about their migration experiences specifically, and specifically where they were when they migrated in their own life course in terms of an outcome for their children. But we know from the ecological developmental models and other theoretical models that we need to think about parents' experiences and sort of where that situates the child in their community and in their own family, and how that might shift their own developmental trajectories. I want to go back to that assimilation picture for 1 second and kind of illustrate, give you an example, not for young children, but an example of why we might care about the life course perspective, and why that might, not using a life course perspective, might give us a different picture of assimilation if we don't sort of think about that. So this is sort of a classic picture that you might see. This is looking at the percentage of Mexican immigrants in the United States and U.S.-born Mexican Americans in the United States, and the percent living with extended kin or non-kin, really the percent living in complex households. And just as an aside, when I first got into the business, we looked at extended family households as some cultural artifact, right? So there's a preference for living with extended kin. You come, you have a more familistic orientation than, say, the individualistic orientation we have in the United States. So people bring that preference with them when they migrate, and that over time, as they assimilate to the United States, they drop that preference for living with extended kin. So that was the model that was going out of vogue when I was coming into kind of research. But what to do next? So this would be sort of a classic picture where we see the percent living with extended kin among recent immigrants. That's that top line, the darker line you see, followed by other Mexican immigrants, right? So it's higher for the recent immigrants, lower for those who have been here longer. That must mean it's assimilation, right? And then we have U.S.-born Mexican Americans are the lowest, right? But what you also see is a very consistent life course picture here. So you're looking at it by age. So here are our young adults down here, our older adults over there, and you see very similar pattern across the life course in the percent living with extended kin. The red line now is Mexico. Okay, so that's the household composition from Mexican census data. And what we're seeing here then is, again, a very consistent life course picture. But the other thing I wanted to point out is our interpretation of whether or not this is consistent with assimilation depends on where we look in the life course. So if we look in the young adult life course, we're looking at people in their 30s, or 20s, 30s, or 40s, we would say that, in fact, the immigration picture looks quite different than the country of origin or those born in the receiving context, right? It does not look consistent necessarily with an assimilation pattern. If we want to see that pattern look a little more consistent, we'd look at older ages. But even there, we see a very consistent life course pattern. And even there, immigrants have a higher percentage living with extended kin than in Mexico or than in the United States. And, you know, as a demographer, I want to think, well, it must be kin availability, right? But immigrants should have lower kin availability than those in the country of origin. So it can't just be kin availability, it has to be something else. There's something about the migration process, right, that leads to perhaps needs to live with kin, right? So you live with family members or other people while you're setting up your own household or looking for housing or looking for a job, and that over time you reduce the need to live with other people. And it doesn't have to do with your preferences at all, it has to do with those instrumental needs. And that migration itself creates those instrumental needs, regardless of what people's preferences might be. So I think this is a very good illustration of where those limitations of that assimilation perspective might be and why we care about where people are in the life course when they migrate and how that relates to other family relationships. Okay, so what we need to do then is integrate a temporal life course approach that emphasizes the importance of the timing of key life events and the location experienced at particular points in time. So where are you in your life course when you migrate, and where were your parents in their life course when they migrated, and how does that then impact outcomes for the second generation? So incorporating both of those things at the same time. Kind of challenging. I don't know that we do it 100% correctly just yet, so I look forward to some feedback about that. I'm going to present some research with really two different examples, and as I said before, some of this research is already published or in the process of, and some of it is still very much a work in progress. The examples I'm going to give you about the timing of migration influencing parents and parenting behaviors, and then perhaps subsequently influencing outcomes for the second generation. Most of that work is out, or we're working on it. Example 2, looking at sort of the association between parents' timing of migration, the neighborhood context in which they're located, and the outcomes for the second generation. That's really new, work in progress. So that's still ongoing. So I do have some preliminary results to present for that. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to think about sort of life course. I'm going to rely on mother's age at arrival. And first, just to reiterate, I think I already said this though, but we have the generational model, right? That's the way we started. We have the first generation. We might think about the 1.5 generation. A lot of research has done this. And my students always ask me, well, how do I code the 1.5 generation, right? Because we're using survey data. You know, how do I code that? And I always say, well, what are we looking at? What's our outcome? What's our theoretical framework here? Depending on the researcher, depending on whether you're reading about socioeconomic attainment, status attainment, you might draw the line one place. If you're talking about developmental outcomes, you might draw it someplace else. But that 1.5 generation we usually think of as people who arrived when they were children. One thing that's important, too, between that distinction between adult migrants and the 1.5 generation is selection of migration, right? Because we think of children not being the drivers of migration. Now, that differs depending on what group we're looking at and what ages we're looking at. Because we do have some children who, say, migrate first, right? They're sent to go to school in the receiving context, and maybe the family follows. So it's not always clear-cut what we're looking at. And then we have the second generation. If we ever divide the second generation, I feel like we divide it maybe by the parents. Do you have one foreign-born parent or two? But we haven't really done very much to disaggregate what's happening within the second generation, other than perhaps those models that talk about segmented assimilation, right? That there's some barriers, structural barriers in the receiving context that lead to differential trajectories within the second generation. And then we have the third generation and the fourth generation. Very infrequently can we actually identify that a true third generation, a true fourth generation. Those researchers that have been able to do this show that there are still differences between the third and then the higher and subsequent generation. But my focus is going to be primarily on that first to second generation. So let's think about the mother's age at arrival. How are we going to divide this? What's important? Why not just, measure it linearly, right? Well, because there are different things that go on in the life course. I apologize to the developmentalists. Things is not correct, but for now, there are different tasks and things that happen depending on where people are in their life course. So if you think about very young children, okay, so very young children who are in the receiving context are going to school. They're going to receive all of their schooling in the receiving context, all of their socialization in the receiving context, all their peer interactions in the receiving context, all of their mate selection in the receiving context. all of their subsequent family formations. And so very little in the sending context, right? And they're going to be parented by, in the receiving context, but by immigrant parents. Okay, what happens in middle childhood? Well, here we have children who are arriving. They may have gone to school in the sending context and the receiving context, but a lot of their peer relationships are going to be in the receiving context and then their subsequent mate selection. And they're going to be tied migrants as well, right? Their parents bring them, for the most part. I'm making some generalizations here, but for the most part, bear with me. Okay, adolescence is a little trickier and a little murkier. And this is the stage of development, I think, that has really been pointed to as most problematic when we're looking at outcomes in the first and comparing to the second generation and later. So immigrants who arrive in adolescence, for example, have higher dropout rates from U.S. schools than those who arrive as younger children, but they're also likely to never drop into school in the United States. So it's not always clear where they've received their schooling and their education. For these immigrants, language acquisition might be an issue in terms of if they never go to school in the receiving context and they enter the labor force immediately. And this may also be the stage in the life course where the context of reception might matter more than other stages in terms of the structural barriers. Racial and ethnic discrimination or segregation might have larger impacts if you've arrived as an adolescent than if you arrived in young childhood or as an adult. That's my hypothesis at the moment. And then we have adults. Now, adults are quite different, also very diverse. Some of them will have formed their family formation, their partnerships, and perhaps even begun their parenting in the sending community, or not, right? They may have met their partners in the receiving community, and they may have their parenting, they may be parenting in both contexts. Okay, so very different. But I think it's very important to think about sort of what's happening across all of these stages. It might not just be a linear process. And I hope by the end, when I show you some of the results from the research we're doing, I'll convince you that no, it's not linear. Okay, so how are we addressing this? Well, we're looking at several different outcomes, and we're looking primarily at very young children. So I'm looking at children of immigrants. So this is primarily the second generation. In fact, almost all of them are second generation. I'm using primarily the results I'll be showing you come from the early childhood longitudinal study, the birth cohort, which probably some of you are familiar with. It's a longitudinal study based on a nationally representative sample of birth certificates in the United States, follows children and their families through early development into kindergarten. And so all of the children in that case, all the children of immigrants will be second generation children, right? So they're all born in the United States and they're all very young children. So we're looking at very early developmental outcomes here. And one of the ideas that we're looking at is that parenting behaviors and activities may be quite different depending on when the immigrant parent arrived in the United States. So they may have two different things going on here. One might be different interactions with social institutions. So parents who arrived as young children will be familiar with those social institutions, right? They will have gone to school in the United States. They may have engaged in extracurricular activities in the United States. They're familiar with child-focused social institutions in the United States, as opposed to parents who arrived as adults. But what about the parents in the middle there? So here I'm just showing you the descriptive outcomes. We're looking at children who are 42 months of age at this point. So this is wave 3, not that you need to know that too much, but wave 3 of the UCLSD. Oh, and I did want to point out, because I'm presenting results and I'm trying to synthesize several different papers here, the cut points we used for mother's age at arrival depended on what we were looking at and depended on the audience we were presenting for. So you're going to see some slight variations here. What you will see always is a young child, a set of mothers who arrived as young children, a set who arrived in either middle childhood or adolescence, and then adults. But where we cut that, and if anybody wants to tell me I cut it wrong, feel free, but we cut it all over the place, depending on what we were looking at. And what you're looking at are the primary child care arrangements by the mother's age at arrival, and you'll notice that the teenage mothers, or those mothers who arrived in that transition to adulthood, are the least likely to rely on formal child care settings and to rely exclusively on parental care. So if you just want to follow the bottom gray bar, ooh, it's like worse contrast than is on my screen, but if you just want to follow the bottom bar, you'll see that there's more parental care only among those mothers who arrived in that transition to adulthood or later teen stage, and very little difference between the U.S.-born mothers and those mothers who arrived between the ages of 0 to 8. And in fact, the bars are remarkably flat. We've divided out, because this was looking at specific kinds of child care, we divided out primarily Head Start versus primarily other center-based care. But what you'll notice is that if we combine those, then the U.S.-born mothers and the mothers who arrived as very young children are not different at all. In fact, the difference you see there in Head Start participation has to do with eligibility and eligibility criteria for participating in specific kinds of child care programs, right? So there's no variation there. But when we look at those mothers who arrived in adolescence, middle childhood and adolescence, we see a different pattern, and then we go back down when we look at mothers who arrived as adults. So it doesn't look completely linear. What happens as children interact with social institutions? We get to the point where all children are interacting with social institutions. Well, what do parents do? The others, well, I'll go back to that. So we're looking at, in this case, parental involvement in schooling. That also varies with the mother's arrival, age at arrival. And in this case, I'm showing you results just briefly from a different data set. This is the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Kindergarten cohort, which means that some of these children of immigrant mothers are immigrants themselves, and some of the children are second generation, but we've combined them for these purposes. And here, again, just showing you how important it is to think about this in terms of comparing the mother's age at arrival, and then also think about this over time. How do things change over time? You're looking at the proportion of mothers who attended an open house at the child's school, right? An event. There's an open event, and we chose open house because this is open to all parents. It's, presumably all parents know about it, although we could talk about linguistic barriers that might limit everybody's knowledge about this. But it's not specifically targeted to an individual child, right? It's not a parent-teacher conference where the teacher contacts the parent and says, come to school. This is something that all parents are eligible to participate in, and is relatively low risk for them. It's not a parent-teacher organization, it's coming to the school. So that's why we chose this measure in this case. And what you see is that mothers who are U.S.-born have higher participation going to these events when the children are in kindergarten. By the time the children are in third grade, right, there's no gap at all, no nativity gap. The foreign-born mothers who arrived as adults increase their participation over time. So they have low participation, they increase it. Consistent with an assimilation story. They become more familiar with the schools, they're more aware that this is something they need to be doing, because the foreign-born mothers who arrived as adults are unlikely to have attended school in the United States. So maybe open houses is not something they're familiar with. Why would I go to my child's school? Well, they become familiar with that concept. So what happens when we look at the other age groups? I hope. Okay. So here we're looking at, I've added in the mothers who arrived as teenagers. That's the orange circles. And then the mothers who arrived in middle childhood, the green. And if we just looked at kindergarten cross-sectionally, again, it would be consistent with a duration story, how long they were in the United States, if you think of age as a duration. But by the time we got to third grade, we'd get a slightly different story, right? It's those mothers who arrived in middle childhood who have the lowest levels of participation, primarily because they didn't increase their participation as much, right? Because there were too many lines, I'm reducing the number of lines here. So now we're looking at the mothers who arrived in young childhood, and I said that for most of the outcomes, there's no difference, no variation for them from the U.S.-born mothers, but I wanted to illustrate that they, too, change their participation over time, and in fact, by the time we get to third grade, those mothers are higher, although basically no difference. There's like no difference there by third grade in their participation, but they started out lower. Okay? So differences in the extent to which mothers are interacting with other social institutions their children are involved in, but not linear by her age at arrival. All right, what about activities that go on in the home? So there are different activities that parents engage in inside the home, and for very young children, a lot of their socialization is occurring within that family context. So what is going on inside those homes? Is there difference in the extent to which parents are involved in these activities with their children by their age at arrival? Is their style of interaction with their children different by their age at arrival? And their knowledge of child development. So there's lots of different measures in here, and I'm kind of giving you like all of them at once. But there are lots of different things that parents are doing. Does that also vary according to the mother's experience as an immigrant in the United States? I think it's very important to consider measures coming from multiple sources. So not only self-reports of the mother. So we ask the mother, do you play with the child? Do you sing songs to the child? Do you tell the child stories? Do you read to the child? Did I say that one already? Those are activities the mother's reporting. We also have very good measures in the ECLSB of others coding of how the mother is interacting with the child. And so I've chosen, in this case, 4 different measures. I have the mother's report of her activities, the interviewer, the actual person who's conducting the interviews with the mothers in the household, observing the mother engaging in tasks with the child. And then the last 2, those scales, emotional supportiveness and negative regard, actually come from independent coding of a recorded interaction of the mothers with the child. So not the interviewers, the person doing the coding is not in the room with the mother, right? So they have no other interaction with the mother. They're just coding the kinds of interactions the mother is having. Is she expressing punitive interactions with the child? Is she correcting the child? Is she scolding the child? Is she hugging the child during this activity that she's supposed to be engaging in with the child? And so that's why you see these 4 different outcomes. And we're also looking at the mothers, U.S. born again, mothers who arrived between the ages of 0 and 12 in this case. So I'm combining those mothers who arrived as young children and middle childhood, mothers who arrived in adolescence and the transition to adulthood, and then those who arrived over the age of 21. And in this case, again, you see some consistencies. There's significant differences from the U.S.-born mothers for all the groups, and I think part of that has to do with combining the 0 to 12 as opposed to the 0 to 8, because we did not see any differences with the younger mothers who arrived at very young ages. I think that's a middle childhood difference there. No difference at all, and very low levels of negative regard. So the idea that parents who are socialized outside the United States, who learn their parenting interactions outside the United States, it seems to be, as one of my colleagues puts it, there is no parenting practice, universal parenting practice that encourages negative regard to children, right? It's low, it's consistently low, nobody does it. I won't say nobody, but you see very low levels of that, and there's no variation. But we do see variation in those other outcomes, in those other kinds of interactions. And here you see that the differences are between, or the ones who have the lowest levels of the mother's reported activities are significantly different for those who arrive as adolescents and adults, young adults, versus the U.S.-born mothers. And again, you see lower levels of coded emotional supportiveness for those who arrived in adolescence and early adulthood. So again, a nonlinear pattern with age at arrival. So what does that mean for children's outcomes? Do we actually observe differences among these second-generation children based on their mother's age at arrival? Are there any differences? So these are the standardized cognitive development scores of 2-year-olds, so bear with me. This is descriptive analysis, so right now this is not controlling for anything. And you're looking at the standardized scores by, again, those age groups. Yeah, we changed them again. So you're seeing the U.S.-born, the mothers who arrived between 0 and 7, those who arrived between 8 and 12, 13 to 17, and 18 and above. And again, we see that nonlinear picture. Do parenting behaviors, do the actions and activities of the mothers help mediate or explain the differences across these mothers' age at arrival categories? So in this case, I am controlling for lots of things, including characteristics of the child's birth weight, the child's previous cognitive score at wave 1, to kind of control for those unobserved traits. We're also adjusting for the mother's education, race and ethnicity, language use in the home, and income in these models, including Model 1 and Model 2. And what we see is that age at arrival is significantly, or the scores for children are significantly different by the mother's age at arrival, and that when we look at the characteristics of the home environment, so the home score is a measure of characteristics, resources in the home and interactions in the home, the mother's report of whether she reads to the child, we looked at many different outcomes, the mother's knowledge of child development, that's a Kitty score that you see up there, and then another score for mother's interactions with the child. And what you see is that those are all significant in helping to explain children's cognitive scores at 24 months, but that they're only significant mediators for the mothers who arrived as adults. I think that's important when we think about that assimilation story and the segmented assimilation story. I'm going to come back to that a little bit when we think about what happens in adolescence, middle childhood and adolescence, that might lead to some different outcomes in the second generation. And could the differences we observe in the second generation then, when people are talking about segmented assimilation, the fact that we see these different trajectories in the second generation, could those be traced back to the parents' migration context and when in the life course those parents arrived? Is that part of that segmented assimilation story? So that's sort of where I'm going, just a hint. Okay, so that's where we were when we were looking at cognitive development by parenting behaviors and knowledge and what parents do within the home. What happens if we look at the context in which immigrant families are located? Does that vary by age at arrival? Does it vary by the life course pattern of migration? And then does that also help explain differences in children's outcomes for the second generation? Again, this is somewhat of a work in progress, but I think we can think theoretically about why community context might vary by age at arrival, and then also why it might have some differential impacts on children's outcomes. So we might expect recent immigrant mothers to live in poorer neighborhoods, and if a segmented assimilation model is at work, then the mothers who arrived in the United States, maybe in adolescence or maybe in young adulthood, maybe those who are labor migrants, have greater neighborhood disadvantage than those who arrived as adults, or maybe those who arrived as young children who will have had more time to receive education in the United States and to be more upwardly mobile in the United States. So the extent to which that neighborhood context reflects the immediate immigration experience of the parents should vary by the parents' age at arrival. To do this, this is the work in progress part, right? So to do this, we took the early childhood longitudinal study birth cohort, and we merged the zip code characteristics for the child. Now, I know that neighborhood gets defined in lots of different ways, and we could rely on census tracts. People say, no, census tracts are too big. You should use block groups. No, block groups are too small. We should actually measure, like the LA Fans does, right? We should measure where people actually go during their day. There's lots of different ways to think about this. And in fact, when I did give a presentation using zip codes data before, I kind of gave that apology. Zip codes are all we have. And someone said, no, you shouldn't apologize for zip codes because nobody knows what the right unit is. Maybe zip codes are great, right? Maybe that's exactly what you should be using. So, okay, I'm not apologizing for zip codes. But zip codes are what we have available to us. And we're still working on sort of thinking through what characteristics of the zip code should we be using and how can we drill down a little further into what those characteristics are and how that might actually represent the community context in which the parents are located. If you think about sort of our models for ethnic enclaves, or our idea that living around other immigrants is somehow supportive, right? That there's greater opportunities, maybe job contacts or social networks, maybe other social institutions surrounding you where people speak the same language you do. You might think that living in a zip code with a higher proportion foreign-born or a higher proportion of linguistically isolated households could be an advantage. On the other hand, when we think about neighborhood deprivation, and we think about resource-poor neighborhoods, living in a neighborhood that has a lot of linguistically isolated households might be a disadvantage. Living in a neighborhood with a lot of with high levels of poverty should also be a disadvantage. So you can kind of think about this in a couple of different ways, and that's, again, why I think we need to think about this in a nonlinear way and incorporate that life course perspective on what exactly was going on in the immigrant life course when we look at outcomes for that second generation. So here you're looking at the percent foreign-born in the zip code, and again, I'm back to my arrive 0 to 7, 8 to 12, 13 to 17, and you see, again, that sort of nonlinear pattern where the highest, the greatest likelihood of living around other foreign-born is occurring for those who arrived at the age, between the ages of 13 and 17, also fairly high for those who arrived in middle childhood, and higher for all of these than the U.S.-born. So here we are seeing significant differences across the board for all of those groups. We look at linguistically isolated households. The Census Bureau defines linguistically isolated households as those in which, a household in which, I'm going to trip over my own tongue here. A household in which no one over the age of 14 speaks English well or very well. Okay, that's the technical definition here. So we considered a zip code to have high levels of linguistic isolation if over 30% of the households were linguistically isolated, met that definition. Medium linguistic isolations are between 10 and 29%, and then low levels of linguistic isolation. We're also working to try to identify linguistic isolation of the child's home in the ECLSD. Can't get a one-to-one match with the census definition. So we're using things like, was the mother interviewed in a non-English language? Does she report that the language of the household is a non-English language? And there was one other thing. Interviewed in non-English language, maybe her, I think it might be her report of how well she speaks English, and then is the home, does she report that the primary language in the home is a non-English language? So we tried to identify those linguistically isolated households. That gets a little tricky. So you see some differences here, and again, that sort of curvilinear pattern. We see that across every outcome we've been looking at except poverty. There's no variation, no nativity variation, and no age at arrival variation in the percent of households below poverty in the zip code across any of these groups. Okay, why would the effects of the community context on children vary by age at arrival? Well, mother's timing of arrival is associated with children's early cognitive development. Hopefully I've convinced you of that with the previous work. And disadvantages in the surrounding community might be detrimental for development over the life course. I've been particularly intrigued by research looking retrospectively in the life course, or those that have longitudinal data from childhood into adulthood, showing that perhaps the cumulative impacts of your neighborhood environment in childhood is even more important than where you live as an adult, and that we see stronger impacts on children, and that as you move around as an adult, the neighborhood context is less important than where you lived as a child. And that's very consistent with a status attainment model, right? What happens to you as a child is really important for building on what's going to be possible later. But then when we think about immigrants, some community characteristics might be positive. So some of those mechanisms that are highly effective for predicting positive child outcomes among the native-born population might not be as predictive for immigrants, and vice versa. There may be some things that are more protective for immigrant families. And I gave that example of being in a linguistically isolated zip code. If you're an adult arrival who does not speak English, it may be beneficial for your young child if you're in an environment where you can communicate with other social institutions, other community groups. You have someone who you know that if you go to the medical clinic, someone will be able to talk with you. And so that might be actually productive. But for those mothers who arrived as children, or say maybe even middle childhood, maybe that protective effect is not there for their children. Maybe it's better if they live in a more advantaged community. So a moderating effect here, right? An interaction. So again, we're using the same data, the ECLSD data, only now we have those merged zip code characteristics, and we're looking at and trying to decide which groups to combine. So in this case, we combine the middle childhood arrivals with the adolescent arrivals based on the significant differences. There was greater consistency for those who arrived in middle childhood and teenage years than when we separated out the young children. So we separated out the mothers who arrived as young children, combined those who arrived in middle adulthood and adolescence, and then have the mothers who arrived at 18 or above. And you see those consistent differences in the nonlinear pattern we were looking at before, particularly with greater disadvantage for those who arrived in middle childhood and adolescence. Linguistic isolated households, that was the one I was telling you we were trying to match. The census definition, not statistically significant. Living in poverty is statistically significant. The main effects for neighborhood characteristics, we were not getting a lot of main effects. I said we divided the households. In this case, I'm just showing you the preliminary results looking at percent foreign-born. We also do this with linguistic isolation. We see that high foreign-born and medium foreign-born. Medium foreign-born is the one where we got a statistically significant main effect. But what happens if we look for those interactions over time. So will we see a differential impact if we look at those interactions? And I think interaction terms are very difficult to show when I show you this actual coefficients and trying to figure out what the heck you're looking at. So in this case, I'm showing you the predicted values, so the predicted cognitive scores by mother's age at arrival and proportion foreign-born in the zip code. So those zip codes that have low percent foreign-born, medium, and high. And what I really want you to focus on is the direction the bars go in, right? So for the U.S.-born and those who arrived as young children, the direction is the same, right? Living in a zip code with lower percent foreign-borns associated with higher scores. It's when we get out to the adults where we see the significant interaction term. So that's a positive. It flips the direction down there so that you actually see slightly higher scores for the mothers who arrived for children whose mothers arrived as adults when they live in zip codes with higher percent foreign-born. And so that's that protective piece I was talking about, right? So maybe it's a benefit to you if you arrived as an adult. Not a lot going on in the middle childhood and adolescent years, however. Okay, so what are we finding overall? Well, overall, parents' migration influences children's experiences. So what happens to the parents and when it happened to the parents, what other things were they doing at the time they were arriving in the United States or in any receiving context influences the outcomes for those children. And I think it's important to note that the effects of mother's age at arrival are not linear. So just putting in mother's age at arrival as a continuous term, squaring it, whatever you want to do to it, is not going to capture this nonlinear pattern. And there's some theoretical implications here. And I think the biggest theoretical implication has to do with thinking about barriers and structural barriers to adaptation over time, to that status attainment, to achieving higher levels of education, to linguistic assimilation over time, perhaps giving us differences, those differential trajectories in the second generation that have been pointed to as segmented assimilation, the idea that some in the second generation do better than others. And I guess in this case I'm arguing that I do think that there are barriers in the receiving community, but I think that when those barriers matter most may have to do with when the parents arrived in the United States and what developmental tasks they had before them when they were immigrants themselves. So second-generation children whose mothers migrated as children look very similar to other children with U.S.-born mothers, but there's more variation for those mothers who arrived at different points in the life course. And I'm particularly thinking in this case of those who arrived in middle childhood and adolescence before school completion, again, maybe never entering school in the receiving context and facing other barriers that might limit the opportunities then for their children. I think this also has some implications for developmental models when we think about combining this interaction between the parents' experiences and the community context in which they live. So depending on when the parents arrived or what other developmental tasks they have before them may influence the extent to which community characteristics are beneficial or not for child development. So when we think about is it better for children to live in areas around other immigrants, maybe by the time children get to school, we won't see that impact. But when children are very young, it looks like having a recently arrived immigrant mother, you're actually better off in a community that has, to the extent the zip codes are reflecting that have a higher proportion other immigrants around you. And so the implications for further study here. I think there are a couple of different implications. One of them is that right now I've just got age at arrival in here. And there are lots of different things that are going on and are associated with age at arrival. And I'm particularly interested in this case in the mode of entry of the parents. So we don't have their refugee status, their documented status, their changing status. Remember the life course picture I showed you in terms of living in a complex household and how that changes over time? Well, parents, or immigrant parents too, statuses may also change over time. So you may be documented at one point, not documented at another. I have the age at arrival in the United States for those who are here. What about those who are return migrants, maybe making multiple immigration trips back and forth? And how might that impact children's outcomes? Are children staying in the receiving context, or are they going back and forth as well with their parents? And how might that also influence us? And we can't observe that with the data we have here. And so I think that really calls for of course, we always want to call for more data, right? But really paying attention not only to whether or not people are foreign-born or not just when they got here, but what else was going on, what other circumstances surround that immigration context, and how does that interact specifically with that family context. The other thing I think we need to think about here are the other contexts in which children and adolescents become migrants. In this case, I'm specifically thinking about other contexts perhaps where children have not been part of the immigration story, right? So maybe sending communities that have sent out a lot of adult immigrants, children are raised in that receiving context. What happens if families migrate back? Bring those children with them. Now those children in a context that may never have had a 1.5 generation before. What happens as immigrants and national origins changing over time? So that's the end of those comments. I want to acknowledge that I'm trying to synthesize many papers here, and so I want to acknowledge my collaborators, both students, former students, and current colleagues participating in the research, and the research supported by NICHD and Center for Population Dynamics IDM, because I did not recognize them now. So thank you very much for being out on Friday. And questions, or I don't know what's going on there.
Thank you so much for that rich, I think there's a lot here to talk about, and I'm sure people have questions. We're going to start with the colleagues from that are in video conferencing in. We want to give them a chance to get into the conversation. They can indicate that they'd like to speak. And if you could please say your name and your institution.
Sí, buenos días. Estamos aquí en el Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Muchas gracias por la conferencia. Vamos a ver si aquí en la sala del Colegio de la Frontera Norte en Tijuana tenemos alguna pregunta o comentario. Yetza, ¿puedes pasar? Tenemos un comentario de la profesora Yetza.
Sí. Hola, buenas tardes. Soy Yetza Bojorquez del Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Y bueno, un punto que me parece interesante resaltar es esta relación entre los resultados de los niños y la edad de migración de las madres, que tiene una forma más o menos de U invertida. Y pienso que, bueno, un hecho bastante conocido es que el desarrollo cognitivo de los niños tiene mucho que ver con el estado de salud mental de las madres. Y en este caso podría ser que las madres que migran en la edad de la adolescencia, por las tareas del desarrollo que tienen en ese momento, tienen más dificultades para establecer una personalidad adulta que pueda darle al niño el medio de desarrollo que se requiere. Entonces, en ese sentido me parecen muy interesantes sus resultados como una guía para intervenciones que se podrían desarrollar justamente con las madres migrantes, con este grupo de mujeres que migran durante la adolescencia y que se van a convertir en algún momento en madres de los niños de la segunda generación.
Gracias, Yetza. ¿Alguna otra pregunta aquí en el colegio? ¿No? Bueno, entonces dejamos esa pregunta para la profesora Glick.
Well, thank you very much for your comment. I think that it is very important to think about what else is going on in adolescence when mothers arrive in the receiving context. We have to think as well about the also control for her education and her current age. So it's not just data to paint her own current age that's driving people. This is a significant difference based on when she arrived in the United States, even net of those characters.
We asked them well, no, it's working. It's a simultaneous translation. It's just, I don't know if it's possible to turn down the Spanish when there's, but we need to hear the English translations. So I guess we'll just.
Sí,
Right.
sí,
Okay.
estamos traduciendo de español al inglés y del inglés al español.
Your
No,
technician.
we think it's wonderful, the translation work. It's just we're trying to sort out the sound here because the Spanish translation comes through quite loud. We'll work it out. Other questions from other colleagues?
Sí, estoy hablando ahorita desde el Colegio de México, aunque estamos de invitadas, somos del CIESAS, de Ciudad de México, y tengo una pregunta para la profesora Glick, que tiene que ver con la característica del estatus migratorio de los hijos en estas familias. Y yo ignoro si en sus bases de datos existe la información, pero si existiera, quisiera saber si la han tomado en cuenta y si tiene alguna diferencia en los resultados que ella ha obtenido para entender si existe alguna dificultad para la integración, asimilación o como se le quiera explicar, que tienen estos hijos de migrantes en los Estados Unidos. Y por supuesto, si existe ese dato del estatus migratorio, con la edad de llegada de los hijos. Gracias.
We do not have the data for the documented status of the mothers, so I can't tell if the mothers are undocumented or not in this data. The children, for most of the analyses you saw, are all born in the United States, so they are citizens of the United States. We have, in another study, we have been working on a community that is very susceptible to changes in immigration law in the United States, in Phoenix, Arizona. I always expect people to ask me about Phoenix. And we know that there is a lot of fear in that community, and I think that reduces children's access to other resources. We know that children get pulled out of school, for example, if the parents are afraid to send them to school. So documented status is very important, but I can't measure it with the data I presented today.
We move to another institution? We could also take some questions from here at UCLA. But we do want to make sure that our colleagues from Mexico and Spain are able to get into the conversation. So please just indicate if you do want to enter.
Question. My name is William from UCLA, and I was just wondering if you associate others' age of arrival and age of.
That is an excellent question, and with the UCLSG, you're trying to figure that out. We do not, because the unit of analysis when they were sampling is per child, right? We actually don't know all of her previous births, even which parity this child is at. As a demographer, was like, oh, we need to know parity here, right? But we do know whether there are other children in the household. The problem with that, and what I'm worried about, is other an incorrect measure of parity will be more distracting, more supporting for some of the age group than others. So let's say we put in other children in the household as a approximation of parity, right? So if there's an older child, then that's an older sibling, or the mother must have started, at a certain age. The problem is, we only know about the children in the household. She's not asked about other children. So let's say, for example, that she's a recent migrant as an adult and she left children in the country with that, and that could distort the results for adult migrants, whereas we're more likely to have picked up on all the children she has for those who were younger when they arrived. So in this case, I'm not sure a bad measure is a good measure to add. I'm afraid I might get misleading results by not having the actual. We are working on that and thinking very hard about that. Right now we have mother's age. We know how old she was when she had this child. But we don't know how many other children she has.
Hi, I'm Tanya from UCLA. I was just wondering if there's any data or any research for plans about fathers.
It is likely to be relevant. In this case, they only concentrated on mothers because there's a lot of missing data in the ECLSD for fathers. They have fathers. Second wave, somebody's going to know this better than I do and going to correct me here, but I think we have fathers in the second wave, and then they are not interviewed again, and then they are kind of skipped waves, and there's a lot of missing information on the fathers. So in order to maximize all the data we had, we started with the mothers. But we do want to look at the fathers, and there is some research. I think the article that comes to mind is one by Natasha Guerrera colleagues, I think, that father involvement, she's just looking at Latino fathers. That she's using, and she looks at father involvement, and there is some variation by father involvement. And I think it would be very interesting to try, what I really want to do, is to try to figure out if the mother's union formation happened in the United States or not. I might get a little closer with that. There will be some data, but we might be able to figure out, kind of how old the father is. I think we know which partner he is. Might know kind of how long they've been together. And that might give us a better sense whether they got together before the migration or after for those adult migrants. So what nobody has asked me about yet is, I have 18 and above or 21 and above there. There could be variation there as well. Now, on average, the younger adult population, right? Because your mother's young children, so I don't have 80-year-olds. But it might be interesting to look a little more, been interested in the idea of foreign students in the sample. And there's some variations there by national origin. So I'm kind of disaggregating across these groups. Also, just might be in there, old in school as an adult, who's in college. So that's a little different as well. So that adult group right now is just out there.
A brief follow-up question on this community feeling. You had information about the couple in the home and also the mother's marital or union status in those models.
Right. Okay. These models have, whether it's two biological parents or not, there's very little variation for the immigrant mother in family structure. There's variation less born, but not a lot of variation just looking at immigrant mother. A lot of two biological parents. The ECLSD, I have a student who's very interested in looking at the change, right? Is there change in family structure over time? And
why don't you go ahead, and then we'll take one more question from UCLA, and then we want to make sure we're inviting our international colleagues in.
Talking about the issue of the selection question nicely, and how you try to look at some of it and you don't have something clear. You're trying to look at some of overly, but I also I wonder, I mean, we'll talk about blending the demography and the policy. What about age of immigration for kids? I've often wondered about what you know about migration in families dependent upon the age of their kids. And so that's what I've always wondered about. And I don't know if there's really just or even about but so here obviously it sounds like an unfair question, but it's really not. I have all the data, but we're talking about what were those parents when they came at certain ages. So I guess the first thing is the ones who came as adults came voluntarily, presumably.
Presumably, yeah.
The ones who came as kids came involuntarily, so right. At one, and I don't. And then within that, I just maybe this is just a point of this. Families that come when their kids are 0 to 5 versus 7 to 9. How are they different in terms of covering education? It's an open question, not something you can.
I think that's a great question. And, well, you know, I'm very interested in that question and thinking about what's been going on in the family life work. And that's what I meant by contextualizing the whole family life. Where does this kid fit in? The whole family's migration experience in the second generation. People you didn't talk about were those adolescents, because I think that's where you get that mix. You get a mix. So you get some adolescents who come by themselves, some who come undocumented by themselves, some are following older siblings, the parents aren't drive, then they become parents, the grandparents aren't here, so that third generation is not here. And I think that's really, for first, wait a minute, go the other way. The first generation is not here. And I think that's really where you're going to, I think that's what we're picking up. I really do. I think that's why that middle childhood adolescence period for mother's age of arrival looks so different from those who arrived as young children and those who arrived as adults. The other thing is I'm very concerned with the data we have with the selection of the national origins of these groups. So the Chinese origin in the data, I just want to break this out for you by origin. The Chinese origin in the data, almost exclusively adult immigrants. So I've run these analyses taking them out, and I get very similar results. So I'm comfortable having them in. But that's a very different selection process for entering the immigration stream than coming as an adolescent or coming as a young child. And that's where I get interested in, well, you know, they come or they migrated in China, you know, came together, are raising children, very purposive, selective migration. It's very different than chain migration. One family member comes, then another family member comes back. You know, I don't know where that family migration life course is. And so I think this concept that immigration is a one-time event and it's an individual event, and if you know the immigrant status of the parents, you know everything about the child is really misleading. So we do our best. You're right. I mean, we do what we can.
I don't mean, or maybe Rod idea, but I mean, is there any scholarship about the extent to which the child affects the decision to migrate? I mean, that's relative when parents were brought to this country. No.
I feel like the research I've seen, and I would love to hear if our Mexican colleague wants that, the research I've seen from Mexico is really on children left behind, right? So it's children who have a migrant, not whether or not the parent decides to migrate and take the child.
Please check your sound. We're not getting a smooth signal in Tijuana. There's a lot of static.
Okay, we're going to check the sound. Can we turn to...
I'll just keep talking.
And we would like to invite you back into the conversation. Anyone?
¿O algún comentario? En Tijuana no tenemos ningún comentario. Muchas gracias.
Tijuana, Mexico City.
No more comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Yo sí tengo.
En Jalapa tienen preguntas, si les abren el micrófono.
Yo tengo, si estás Golfo.
Okay.
First, I want to say thank you very much. And I want to say hi to Marjorie. Marjorie, remember me? Patricia Zamudio.
Hello, hello.
And Anabela Cruz is here too with us. So hello. I just have one brief question and I'm gonna get it in Spanish. Solamente saber de las implicaciones para política pública que pueden tener este tipo de estudios pública en los Estados Unidos, relativo a las escuelas, relativo a facilitar o no el involucramiento de los padres, el involucramiento de los padres en la educación de sus y en el fortalecimiento de las comunidades. That's it.
Thank you. I think there are some implications here for public policy for schools. Schools have done a pretty good job, well, some schools have done a very good job of reaching out to immigrant parents, and other schools do not. But most of the outreach has been based on language, trying to make sure that there is information about schooling sent home to the parents in the language of origin. I don't think we see as much, and schools could do a lot more, educating parents or orienting them to what schooling in the United States is like and how it might differ from the country of origin. So for parents who have never sent a child to school in the United States and have never attended a school in the United States, there may need to be some more orientation to what's expected of parents and what will be expected of children. And so that goes beyond just thinking about the language used in the home or the language the parents are comfortable interacting in. And then the other public policy issue for schools right now is thinking about how anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States impacts the availability of schooling and the willingness of parents to interact with schools or even send their children to school at all in the United States. So I know there was just a report from Sonora about the large increase in school enrollment in Sonora, and the expectation is that these are people who have migrated back from the southwestern United States and are trying to enroll their children in school in Sonora. So that may lead to some very similar public policy issues for schools in Sonora and for schools in the southwestern United States. That sort of binational public policy issue in schools will be interesting.
Gracias.
Questions anywhere? Did we get to Spain? I know you're probably tired. And Friday night, no less. Back to UCLA then, perhaps? Any questions, comments? Andrew. Mm-hmm.
Do you have indicators of school quality that you could?
Yeah.
What is neighborhood effects? How much of them are really?
Okay, so keep in mind that the first set of data, ECLSC, those kids are not in school yet. When they enter kindergarten, there are administrator who are the schools they've gotten selected into. We'll also be able to tell whether or not, well, I think we'll be able to tell whether or not those schools are in the same zip code, and that'll give us a better indication of whether our zip codes were good indicators. For the ECLSK, you do have some indicators of school quality. I have not used a lot of that data. The problem for doing research on children of immigrants is I'm going to lose a lot of my variation, a lot of missing data, once you try to put that school data in. And so if I want to be able to have sufficient statistical power across these age of arrival groups, I may not be able to do that with school quality, unless, of course, the next step would be multiplication across schools, multiple imputation at multiple levels of analysis. So, yes, because the administrators, it's separate set of data. So the administrators are reporting on the school. There's great teacher data in the ECLSK. If anybody's really interested in sort of the teacher's assessment of students and their classroom, there's great data there. But I don't think you're going to be able to do it by mother's age at arrival unless you're going to do a lot of multiple implication dealing with missing data. And I've done some of that, but not with the school data.
A little shy to speak on
in multiple continents.
Not at all. Maybe I'll see. As an ethnographer, this really, the take-home message is really important and clear to me. And to understand, because so often we talk about immigrants like they're one thing, and you really help us see these are some things that matter. A life course and age of arrival. And I think that's such an important message. Then when we talk and we complicate it further, and we know there's all these other factors that could be playing in to the meaning, to interpreting these differences, that's where I struggle a little. So can you say anything about what we should be taking about the specific kinds of differences, and then also in relation to this larger message of you need to pay attention to these kinds of
it is extremely complex. So there are multiple things going on across the life course and multiple things that go along with immigration. And so trying to combine those two, I think, is a real challenge and has been really exciting to try to understand what's going on. I think the take-home message for me about the life course here is thinking about that 1.5 generation a little more carefully in terms of what opportunities are available to children and how does that influence the way they themselves become parents. And I think that's really the piece we are missing. But I think my hypothesis, again, is that a lot of the results we've seen that have been attributed to segmented assimilation, the idea that there are just blocked opportunities for entire national origin groups, for example. When we think about discrimination in the United States and segregation in the United States, but some of that is really based on when in the life course immigrants have arrived and they encounter those barriers. Encountering a structural barrier to socioeconomic achievement in adolescence, in middle childhood, has much more important long-term impact and implications for many generations to come, I think, than encountering what may be a temporary barrier in early childhood that is then overcome later, or part of the duration of residence process for adult migrants. I'm not saying there aren't barriers for those who arrive as adults. There are. But in terms of thinking about the cumulative impact for the second generation, the third generation, and then the fourth and higher, we'll never get data on the fourth and higher, but we could do third. I think there's going to be long-term intergenerational implications for those who arrive at that critical point in the life course. That achieving education, attaining education, really is that important marker. And I think it's really difficult, and people face the greatest barriers when they come in that middle childhood, adolescent period.
Right. Well, I think we will probably wrap up, and we'd really like to thank everyone on these 3 continents. Mexico's 2 continents. Yes, those 2 continents. These 3 countries, and dealing with the time change and the video and the audio. And thank you all for this experience here today, and I hope we can do it again.
Marjorie, ¿me permiten dar un último mensaje, por favor? Laura
A last comment? Certainly.
Pues muchas gracias por la conferencia.